Who are you?
Hi, I'm Al Bond.
Okay. Where did you work?
Well, the place you'd be the most interested in work, I worked at what was then called the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas. It's now called the Johnson Spacecraft Center. But at the time I was there, we knew it as the MSC, Manned Spacecraft Center.
How did you get to work there?
I got a job there not the normal way. I'd gone to Houston looking for a job there. My background is in broadcast television. And so I was trying to find a job there, and NASA was spread all over the city of Houston at the time because they hadn't opened the big complex. And everybody I talked to, they looked at me like a cow looking at a new gate. They had no idea what I was asking. So I pretty well chucked it in and went back on to work. One day when I walked into my broadcast station where I was working, the chief announcer said, "Come into the sound booth with me, I have a question for you." And so I did, and he said, "How would you like to work at NASA?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he handed me a phone number and he said, "Call this gentleman, he's looking for somebody just like you." And I called him, and the man actually hired me on the phone. But I said, "No, first of all, I've got to come and see what the job is all about." So I went to Houston and saw it and said, "Yes, I'll do it." And that's how I got involved. Now, this was during the Gemini program, which is prior to Apollo.
Okay. What happened on the best and worst days?
Over what period of time? Are we talking about from the time I started there? Are we talking about when we flew to the moon on Apollo 11? Or are we talking about other times?
When you started there.
When I started there. When I started there, the first thing that was so difficult for me is when I worked in mission control. And my position in mission control was that of coordinating the television and radio networks of the world to what we were going to do and when we were going to do it. And the things they were saying in mission control, they could have been talking another language. I had no idea what a vector was, or a roll program, or so on and so forth. So I sat there kind of looking at the walls thinking, what are they saying? I don't understand. But over time, I learned what they were talking about. I knew what programs to look at on the big board, and I could understand what was going on. That was the most difficult thing for me to do. Over the years in working there, there were a lot of times. Are we focusing really on just difficult times right now?
Yes.
Okay, difficult times. One of the astronauts was traveling from one part of the country to another in his jet plane, and he crashed it and killed himself. And I got called in we went up and we had calls from television and radio stations all over the world, and I was on the phone answering these calls, and in many cases they put me live on the air so they could ask me questions and then suggest all these other reasons why that might have happened. The absolute worst time that I had was we were planning, the organization that I worked with in it were having a big party. It was near the end of January, and we were all dressed to go, and the TV was on, and then there was a bulletin. There's been a fire at the Cape. Uh-oh. And we're not sure what the situation is, but there's been a fire. So we then decided we weren't going to a party. I went immediately back to work. When I arrived there, I saw my boss and I said, "How many?" And he said all 3 men were killed. And they were killed in a fire in the Apollo 1 spacecraft. Now, a little side to that is that several years prior to that, I had gone with the rest of the team to California where they were building the spacecraft. And they talked about all the systems and this and that and the other. And finally they got to the point, they said, now we'll talk about the door. Wow, the door. I understand a door. I go in and outdoors every day, so I think I know what a door really is. And they said, our door is held on with 28 bolts. He said, what? Jim and I had a handle. You just opened the door and you got in or got out. This one's held on with 28 bolts. And they immediately said to us, shut up, PAO, Public Affairs, which we were. We know what we're talking about. They said, what do you think would happen if we were halfway to the moon and somebody happened to hit the handle on the door and opened it? We said, not a thing different than if you're 120 miles above the earth. Don't talk to us about that, PAO. The 3 men died in the spacecraft because they could not open the door. They had 28 bolts to take off with a roaring fire around them. 6 months later, we had a new door, and it had a handle. That was a great day.
What were you feeling in the first 5 seconds of liftoff and in the last few seconds when they were landing on the moon?
At liftoff, it was, by the time we got to Apollo 11, it was pretty much routine. We'd already flown quite a few other Apollo spacecrafts, but it's always extremely exciting to see a space rocket that's taller than the Statue of Liberty lift off the pad, then go up into space. So that was a very, very exciting moment for us because we knew we were on the way, and the mission for Apollo 11 was to actually land on the moon. We'd been there several times before, but we never had landed. So this was our opportunity to know that we were going. We were very, very excited about that. Over the ensuing several days, things were pretty quiet as the spacecraft traveled to the moon. And then we got to the moon, and the astronauts got into Eagle, the spacecraft lander. And as they did that, they then closed the hatch, pulled away, and went down to the surface of the moon. Well, you only have so much gas in a spacecraft. And when they got down to where they were thinking they were going, they found it to be a terribly rocky field, which they couldn't possibly have landed on. So now they had to find a new place to land. And Buzz Aldrin, the co-pilot, was using a slide rule with his big space gloves, trying to plot new vectors for where they were going to land. They finally found a place that Neil Armstrong felt he could land in. They were down to 30 seconds of fuel left. Half a minute. If they didn't do something within the next few seconds, they would have to abort and come home. Neil landed with less than 30 seconds of fuel, and we were tight as we could be in that mission control. We weren't saying a word, but everybody was shaking like a leaf, afraid that we wouldn't make it.
What was something that no one knew except for the people in mission control?
Well, there were several things that were going on in mission control during that time. When we landed on the moon and things settled down, Buzz Aldrin took out a little pack that he was carrying that his minister had given him. And out of it he pulled a small flask of wine and a small piece of bread. And he held communion right there on the surface of the moon. Now the people in the public did not know that, because we had a lot of people here in the country that refused to allow us to talk about religion back then even. So that was one of the things that was going on. Let's see what other things were happening that, well, they were all
Could you
getting...
maybe talk a little bit about what Neil Armstrong said, his famous quote, and I know that you've shared that before about his famous quote when he landed and what he said as opposed to
What he thought he was going
what
to
he
say.
thought he was going to say.
Well, Neil Armstrong, as you know, when he stepped on the surface of the moon, he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." It was going to be one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. A man kind of got left out of that, but that's okay. We didn't worry about that too much. So that's what happened when we landed on the moon and they got out. Now, in Mission Control, things were completely different, because in there, the flight director, Gene Kranz, told us as we were ascending to the moon, when we land, and we will, I do not want to hear one sound in this room. We have men's lives at stake. We have no idea what the surface of the moon is like, and we may have to leave instantly. So I want no sound so we can work right. Behind the glass wall behind us was a room filled with VIPs. When we landed on the moon, they went crazy. They were shouting and hollering and jumping up and down and shaking each other and hugging and just doing all kinds of things. But in Mission Control, it was totally quiet.
How did you react when they made it there and back?
We were thrilled, as was the rest of the world. When we made it there, and I released the video showing Neil coming down the ladder, probably every possible TV set in the entire planet watched that ascent. Everybody was glued to their television watching, because no one had ever done this before. And so that's the major reaction. Upon splashing down in the Pacific on return, everybody sighed a sigh of relief. We have done it. We're there. We're back. The guys will be safe.
How many days were they up in space?
The total trip from the launch pad to the moon, to the surface of the moon, off the moon, and back to Earth, and down in the Pacific Ocean ran about 8 days.
Were people in Mission Control 24 hours a day, or did they work in shifts?
There were shifts working. There were 3 shifts in Mission Control. And all the people in Mission Control, each one of those people in Mission Control had a separate room outside Mission Control where 20 plus people worked in there. So when flight says retro, everybody in the retro room immediately is listening. When he asks the question, the guy in the room is given the answer and flight gets the answer immediately. But there were 3 shifts of us, and we worked 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day.
How big was the ship and what was her name?
How big was the ship and what?
What's her name?
What was in it?
What was her name?
Oh, what was the name? The command module's name was Columbia. The lunar lander was named Eagle. Eagle was the lander. The Apollo command module was big enough to hold 3 astronauts side by side. The exact dimensions I could get for you if you really need it, but the size would be similar to a front seat of a car, and that's about all it was. And then there was a little space they could stand in front of that, but there was not a lot of room in there. I've been in the Apollo capsule, and I can assure you there's not a lot of room for partying in there.
What were some things they added to her that wasn't on the last ship?
I need you to say the question again for me. What did they add when?
What were some things they added to the ship that wasn't on the last ship?
Oh, you mean on the mission before?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they had a camera on the Eagle so that when they landed, we could show Neil coming down the ladder. That was an item that wasn't there. Pretty much each one of the spacecrafts were identical. They had all the same items in there, unless there was some specialty thing they were going to do. On Apollo 11, there were a minimal amount of things there because we didn't know where we're going and what we were doing. There was places on there to store the rocks that they brought back, and the rocks that the guys retrieved from the moon, we had them tested, and they turned out to be 3.7 billion years old, the rocks that they brought back from the moon, which is pretty old. The later Apollo spacecraft carried lunar rovers, which were little electric carts like golf carts they could drive around on the moon, and gave them a much wider range. When we actually landed on the moon, we spent 23 hours and 18 minutes on the moon, but we only spent 2 hours and 36 minutes actually walking on the moon.
In a picture, they have the flag, but there's no wind on the moon. Mm-hmm. So how did they get that for the flag to stand up?
The flag, there was a metal bar that raised up, and the flag hung on it, and the flag hung down, because there is some gravity on the moon. But they found it extremely hard to get the pole into the ground to hold the flag up. That was very hard to do. But it looked like it was flying in the breeze because there was a rod through the top of the flag to hold it up now.
How did you get the money to build the ship?
The United States government paid for it.
What kind of fuel did you use?
It was a rocket fuel, which is a certain blend of alcohol. One of the things you might be interested in knowing, that when the Apollo 11 launch when it launched, the rocket was burning 27,000 pounds of fuel per second. That's enough to fill 17 swimming pools a second. That's how fast it was burning fuel. Now, obviously, as you burn fuel, the spacecraft gets lighter. And as it gets lighter, it goes faster because you're burning the same amount of fuel. To be in Earth orbit like the space station is right now, they're moving at 17,500 miles an hour. To break Earth's orbit to go to the moon, they had to go up to 22,000 miles an hour. Now, once we were all through and returning, coming back, the spacecraft coming back from the moon was moving at over 24,000 miles an hour. So you can see if you were standing out there in space and you wanted to see it go by, you wouldn't, because it would go by so fast you couldn't see it. That's a lot of speed, especially when you think 50 or 60 miles is fast. Try 22,000 miles an hour. Ann, do you have a question? You look like you wanted to ask a question about that.
How many gallons were in the ship? How many
In the rocket itself?
Mm-hmm.
I do not know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. I know they burned 27,000 a second, and it burned for nearly a minute, so you could multiply 27 times 60, and you know how many gallons of fuel were in the first stage. Then there's a second stage after that, and then the third stage is the command module and the lander all had power. Okay?
Thank you.
My pleasure. Hope you enjoy it.